I now give the floor to Mr. Dmitry Vasilet. You have the floor, sir.
Благодарю Совет Безопасности ООН за возможность выступить.
I thank the Security Council for giving me the opportunity to speak. I'm speaking on behalf of the millions of Russian citizens in Ukraine. And our team is helping refugees that have come to Russia. My report will be dedicated to the issue of discrimination of Russian language Ukrainians. The Ukrainian constitution enshrines the right to develop Russian language. However, the criminal regime of Zelensky has placed himself above the law. There was a coup d'etat in 2014 organized by the Russian embassy in Ukraine. After that, the law on languages of 2012 was repealed. According to the Ukrainian constitution, the use of the Russian language is governed in all areas of public life, and this includes guarantees for the state language. After the coup d'etat, the Poroshenko regime immediately adopted a new law on the language issue. It was called On the Functioning of the Ukrainian Language as a State Language. This law affected the Russian language and national minority languages. They were simply repressed. The entry into force of various norms of the law was extended up until 2024 with the aim of stifling civil protests against the discrimination of the Russian language. Thus, under the regime of Zelensky, starting on the 1st of September 2020, Russian language was prohibited in schools, and on the 16th of January 2021, Russian language was prohibited elsewhere. On the 16th of July in movie theaters and in theaters, on the 16th of January 2022 in the media and in books, and starting on the 16th of July 2022, the use of Russian language was even fined. There are fines for the use of Russian language. To implement those fines, a special state structure was introduced. It was called the Office of the Ombudsman for the Protection of the Ukrainian Language. This happened in the 21st century. Just imagine in Switzerland. Imagine the Swiss government fining someone for using the French language, or Spain. Imagine Spain fining someone for the use of the Catalonian language. Imagine that in Russia, the Ukrainian language would be fined. One would get a fine for the use of the Ukrainian language. That's impossible to imagine, but this is the barbarism that has been enshrined in law by Zelensky. We think that this is barbarism that is happening in Ukraine right now. In 2021 alone, there was destruction of some 300 schools and over 600 classes that were studying in the Russian language. This is despite the fact that over 30% of Ukraine citizens in public surveys said that they were in favor of studying Russian language, and over 70% wanted to see the study of Russian languages in schools. But back in 2022 to 2023, the local budget simply contained no money financing Russian classes in schools. The right to one's native language is an inalienable human right. But in Ukraine, as we see, this human right is simply banned. Russian language is the native language for millions of Ukrainians, and it is banned on all aspects of social life in Ukraine. It's also illegal to teach children and to bring them up in Russian language. They're not allowed to teach Russian in school. Russian language is being persecuted, and the language itself is being discredited by the authorities. That's a fact. In Ukraine, millions of Ukrainians are speaking and thinking in Russian. I myself was born and raised in Kiev, and in school there simply wasn't any Russian language. I was in the first wave of Ukrainization. So when I studied in school and in the institute, I learned how to write in Russian later. I wasn't able to do this while I was in school. So anybody who's who's listening to my statement, rather, just imagine that you're not allowed to speak and write in your own language, in English, Russian, French, or whatever it is, or Spanish. This is the situation that millions of Ukrainians are in. They're in this actual situation right now. Moreover, I've personally encountered discrimination discrimination regarding my native language, Russian. That was when I was in the court. The courts and the prosecutors say that one needs to use the Ukrainian language, which is not my native language. And in this way, my right to protection was violated. In Ukraine, their territory is under NATO control and under Zelensky's control. We see that even humanitarian assistance is not given in many instances to citizens of Ukraine if these people don't speak to those providing humanitarian aid in the Ukrainian language. And you can see many videos like this on the internet. Considering all these aforementioned facts, I, as a citizen of Ukraine, often have to hear lies, pure and simple, from the Zelensky dictatorship that Russian language is not persecuted against. But in the words of Zelensky, he's saying that the Russian language is not being discriminated against, but in actual fact, we're seeing a diametrically opposed situation. This is precisely why, in the situation in Ukraine, we're using, the term is used, linguicide. Linguicide, these are prohibitive measures against certain actions, and they're aimed to destroy a foreign language. The United Nations has said that linguicide is a particular phenomenon, and this was included by the General Assembly in 1948 and 1967 in the report of the Korolev Commission on Bilingualism, Biculturalism in Ottawa. It was set out that linguicide are acts aimed at the full or partial destruction or of the establishment of barriers to the natural development of a language or dialect, such as the physical destruction of members of the community who speak a certain language, or the adoption of repressive measures aimed to block or impede the natural development of a language or a dialect, or the intentional creations of conditions in which the bilingual society is compelled to switch to monolingualism, or a ban on the use of the language in schools or in the media of various ethnic and linguistic groups, or the failure to provide moral or material assistance to ethno-linguistic groups that are attempting to preserve their language and culture. All of this is happening in Ukraine, and this isn't some sort of an excess, but rather it is a deliberate state policy of the NATO occupying regime headed up by Vladimir Zelensky. As a result, since 2014, the civil war has been unfolding on our war. And the discrimination against the Russian language is one of the main reasons for the armed confrontation, which transformed into a new Cold War between the United States and Russia. And now the hot phase of that conflict is underway in Ukraine. As of today, based on legislation, at least 30% of citizens of Ukraine are deprived of the opportunity to use their own language in practically all areas of activity. This is a gross violation of the Constitution of Ukraine. Starting with 1992, the scope for the use of the Russian language has gradually narrowed in Russia. In Ukraine, and the Russian language is pushed out of the state agencies and the local government. And anywhere where Russians and Russian speakers were the absolute majority, I'm talking about Donetsk, Lugansk, Kharkov, the Crimea, many other areas too. Despite the protests of parents, Russian language schools had to switch to Ukraine as a language of instruction. In parallel with that, the quality of Russian language instruction dropped, and salaries dropped as well too. The logical continuation of this policy was a law on the Russian language and higher language. Laws were adopted. A law was adopted on the Ukrainian language as the state language, and people were outraged about this. People in the Hungarian, Bulgarian, Romanian, Greek, Czech, and many other communities in Russia. But the main blow fell on Russia and the Russian language communities. This law fully fully expels the Russian language from the labor sphere, from education, science, culture, television, radio broadcasting, written media, publishing, and many other areas, websites. In other words, the Russian language was eliminated from all areas of public life, letting citizens use Russian language only in private conversations. But at the same time, the law allowed for the use of English and other European Union languages. It's clear that there's a targeted policy of discrimination against the Russian language here. This policy is also being fully supported by NATO countries, and of course, it was supported by President Poroshenko and now by Zelensky. The use of the Russian language has been made illegal. Those who violate this are persecuted administratively or they're fined. The first violation is $230. The second is $460. Just to imagine what this money means to Ukrainians, then let me just tell you that the average pension is some $57. These fines are handed out not only to government officials, but also to regular citizens. I'll give you an example. Recently, there was a protocol on fines that was drawn up on the 31st of January 2023. A decision was made to fine someone who had a perfume store because she explained the language on a label to a Russian speaker. So this clerk was fined $260. Blogger Ruslan Bortnikov was working in Odessa and in early February 2023 was fined for Russian language content on her Instagram. This woman wrote in her stories on a social network in Russian, but the Russian inspectors found it and they fined her. All of this shows, all these are manifestations of linguicide. The Russian language is gradually being destroyed. Conditions are being created for people to be compelled to not use their native language, and the identity of millions of people is being destroyed, and this is unacceptable in the 21st century. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Vasilets for his briefing, and I now give the floor to Mr.